All right. Okay, so thank you, Herman. My name is Neil Rozon. I'm a Dementia Care Coach at the Dementia Society of Ottawa and Renfrew County. I've been with the organization for almost 10 years, and my role as a Dementia Care Coach is to provide support, education, assistance in navigating the healthcare system. It's not always easy. And I work with families in person, not as much right now due to COVID, but normally we would work with families in person, in groups, on telephone, whatever meets your needs. And I'm particularly interested in dementia care because I was personally involved, in dementia care with my grandmother, and that's kind of what got me interested in this field. And also, I just find it very amazing to help people go through this journey. It's not always easy, but a lot of people say that with the right support, we get through this. So today our guest is Carol Homes-Kerr. Carol has been a caregiver for many years and is currently a volunteer, an advocate. She's a great support to the dementia community. So thank you, Carol, for taking part in this webinar. Before we begin, is there something in general that you'd like to share about yourself, just to give people an idea a bit about yourself and your partner, Jim, who was diagnosed with dementia?
Okay, thanks, Neil. Well, I met Jim in, to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a retired nurse and an addictions counselor, retired from that too. And when we found out that Jim had dementia, it didn't take an awful lot for me to reach out for help, because that's what I was teaching people to do for addictions, for sure. So I connected with the Alzheimer's Society. We were living near Sarnia. I had a job there. Jim was retired. We met in 1988 and got married in 1989. It was second marriage for both of us. He had 5 children, and I had 2 from my first marriage. He had 5 from his first marriage. So it was good. You know, he was actually 16 years older than I was. I didn't believe it, because here was this tall, good-looking fella who did not look his age, but we fell in love. So, the rest is history after that, right? And I swore that after our experience that if I could in any way, because the Dementia Society had been so good to us, that I would give back in some way. And so I had skills, group skills, and offered to do a caregiver support group, and currently co-facilitate with Neil and Monique, the Connections group, and also sit on the Caregiver and Partner Advisory Committee at the Dementia Society, and just recently became a Dementia Friendly Trainer. So I'm pretty involved, and I love every minute of it. Volunteering with the Dementia Society has been very rewarding, and I feel so appreciated by them.
Well, thank you, Carol, and for sure the Dementia Society could not offer the programs the way we do without the support of volunteers, so thank you for that, for sure. And we'll have a chance, hopefully, to talk more about these different roles that you mentioned as we go along with our conversation. But you mentioned, the early days and when Jim got his diagnosis. Looking back, what were some of the maybe early warning signs that you had that something was not quite, usual with Jim? What were some of these, changes in his abilities you were noticing?
Mm-hmm. Well, he was a pretty technical guy, and he started. He actually worked for the Department of National Defense, and he was a quality assurance inspector during his job, and worked a lot with electronics. And he started having a few problems with the, television and some of the computer. But I think what really kind of clued me in was he was diagnosed in 2008. But as I look back, and I hear this a lot from people who are caregivers, as I look back, it started well before that. There were times when he would become confused and he didn't seem to know where he was, and that would come and go. So it's easy to excuse it as maybe being overtired or something like that. He would, he would have trouble with the computer, but again, so did I. So it's like, I was working and I would ask him to do something, and I would get home and of course it wasn't done. So, and he would deny that I had ever asked him. That led to a lot of arguments. And then in 2006, I remember I went to a training session in Memphis, Tennessee. And I called him when I got there. It was late at night. I called him when I got there, and he didn't answer the phone. And I got quite concerned about it. But the next morning, I called again, and he didn't know where I was. He had completely forgotten that I had left, and yet he had driven me to the airport in Detroit the day before. So, and he was actually angry at me because he thought I just didn't come home that night. He didn't know, but he knew I wasn't there, and he was angry with me. But he didn't seem to realize that was an issue. Anyway, I thought, well, that is really odd. And then one day he was having more and more trouble with different machinery that we had. We lived in the country. We had a beautiful house on Lake Huron. And he had a riding lawnmower and a snowblower, and he couldn't operate these things anymore. And we had gotten a generator, and he had no idea how to hook it up. And one day he went to make the bed, because he did a lot of the housework because I was working full time. He went to make the bed, and he said, turned to me and he said, does the sheet go on first or the blanket? And I knew there was a problem then, and I knew I had to go and get some help. So I went to the Dementia Society in Sarnia. And at that point in time, they didn't have education sessions. All I got was books to read. So there were things that I didn't want to see. I think part of the caregiver doesn't want to see those things. Other times it was easy to explain away, but there comes a time when you realize there's something wrong. Yeah.
Well, for sure, you've mentioned quite a few of these early signs, the memory loss that affects day-to-day functioning, changes in the ability to perform familiar tasks, personality changes, mood disturbance. Like, those are great, things to notice. And if people are concerned with those changes in their family members, to consult and get some support early on, because sometimes these causes these symptoms might be due to something that could be reversed. So getting a diagnosis, talking about it with health professionals, I think is really important. As soon as you notice these changes, it's not a normal part of aging to be experiencing these symptoms. And getting a diagnosis, like you mentioned, Carol, a lot of emotions, or when you're in this process, people talk about being in denial, such as, you mentioned, or being in shock, or being angry or sad. What were some of your emotions and Jim's as well as you were going through this process?
Well, first I'd like to let you tell people, one of the most valuable things that that I did was going to the Dementia Society. And the reason I went was because I was working in mental health, and psychogeriatrics wasn't very far from the addictions department. And I knew a social worker that was there, and she recommended that I go to the Alzheimer's Society when I told her what was happening. One of the things that the nurse at the Alzheimer's Society told me or recommended that I do is, of course, read about this and educate myself. Also, to get our wills updated and get a powers of attorney in place, which I thought was pretty premature, but it wasn't, because it took a year to get there. Because Jim was a little skeptical. He thought I was going to take all his money, which he didn't have, but he, you know, that's part of that paranoia. There's a certain amount of that goes with the dementia. The other thing that she said, start documenting all of the odd things that are happening, so that when you get to see the doctor, that you have these things laid out so she can see what's been happening. All of this collateral information was valuable when we actually did get to see the doctor. The doctor did the usual, did the mini mental test. She did a CAT scan. She did blood work and a thorough examination, and we got the diagnosis that he had dementia of the Alzheimer's type. Jim was really upset with that. His mother had it. His grandmother had dementia when she died. And the last thing he wanted to believe was that he had it. So I remember hearing it, not really wanting to believe that this was happening. And I was numb to begin with. I don't really remember the drive home. But then I went into denial myself. This can't be happening. And then it set in, and I felt angry, and I felt frightened. I didn't know what was going to happen from there. I think those were the main emotions that I had. And I knew that, did I want to stay and take care of somebody? Well, it never occurred to me not to, but I know some people don't. Mm-hmm. And just the uncertainty of it was a little upsetting. It was very upsetting what was going to happen.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that experience, Carol. And we hear that a lot from families when they are in a similar process of getting a diagnosis and dealing with things. And what we recommend at the Society, if you were calling me and describing this situation, I would encourage you to take part in some education and some support. And that's something that we offer with couples, families, is to take part in sessions to just better be prepared and to educate yourselves about the disease, the changes that are happening, more importantly, strategies, and also that sense of connecting with others, because sometimes people feel very alone during these times. They don't know who to talk to. There's still a lot of stigma around dementia. They don't want to worry family members, but at least connecting early, the earlier the better, is really key, I think, in coping with the disease in the long run, in the long term. We also say, Carol, that a key to living well with dementia is to remain socially active, physically active, to challenge your brain, that sort of thing. And that's something we talk about a lot in our sessions with people who are newly diagnosed. They say, what can I do to fight dementia? I've been prescribed a medication, but what else can I do? And we talk about all the non-pharmaceutical ways to fight dementia. So maybe if you have ideas of what were some of the activities that Jim and yourselves did to make sure that you lived well despite this diagnosis, and that you were trying to, you know, live well with dementia.
Well, one of the things that I did right from the beginning with the Dementia Society in Sarnia was they offered caregiver support groups, and I joined the caregiver support groups, and I found that very helpful. It's really important to be able to sort of bare your soul with people that are in the trenches with you, you know, are doing exactly the same thing or experiencing the same thing, and feeling that you're not alone, and feeling that you're truly understood. And certainly when I came to, well, it was just general support groups that I was going to in Sarnia. Also, Jim was, they actually had an early stage support group for people with dementia in their early stages. And Jim would go to that. And he actually quite enjoyed it, although he said, you know, they've all got worse problems than I do. That's fine. He went, and it was a good socializing for him, other than me. We also, when we moved back to Ottawa in 2009, he was diagnosed in 2008. And then in 2009, it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to drive for much longer. He was still driving at that point. He was getting lost. He was not able to manage traffic in the city. There was just too much going on, and he had difficulty making decisions then. So we came back to Ottawa, where we have family and friends. Two of his boys live here, and we have some really long-term friends that said, come back, we'll help you if we can, if you'll let us. And so when we got back here, we started to go to support groups. I did. First call I made when my phone got hooked up was the Dementia Society, because I knew that's where to go. And we got hooked into a couple of groups, certainly the Connections group, which I now co-facilitate with Neil and Monique. We went to that for, I don't know how many years, quite a while, and quite enjoyed that. And I started going to the Wives group, which doesn't exist anymore, but I found that very helpful and met some long-term friends there, women whose husbands had dementia. And found that it's kind of a unique relationship, in that this is a spouse that you had dreams with. You had, you hoped that you would be able to travel and do all these things, and then that's been taken away, slowly goes away. And to be able to talk about that, I mean, it was okay to talk to my friends, but they didn't truly understand, like the people, the women that I met in the Wives group. And that was very, very helpful for me. I find that this happens in the Connections group because it is spouses, and there's a lot of really good sharing that happens there. We also started to go on a regular basis with very good friends to the NAC. We attended the monthly CTV Pop series, and we did that as long as we could, until Jim started singing louder than the people on stage. We had to stop because there was no stopping him. If he wanted to sing, he sung. And one of the main things that he enjoyed in the day programs. So we did that, and we spent time with close friends until it got very difficult to even do that. So, and we did spend time with his sons. again, not unusual from what I hear. So that was pretty much our social life. And I have a hobby. I do pottery, and I maintain that all through that. And I think if I hadn't had that, I would have found it very difficult. It gave me a break.
Mhm.
So.
That's great insight, Carol. I completely agree that the idea of connecting with peers is so important. Not everyone has the support that they need from family or friends, and when you find yourself in a group with people experiencing similar challenges and going through similar changes, it's very helpful, I think, to hear from others that what you're experiencing is normal. If you're feeling angry, if you're upset about something, you'll get a lot of head nodding, yes, I get it, I understand. And it's I think very important in moving forward is to get that support, from your peers. And that's something that we offer, like we said at the and as you mentioned at the Dementia Society, is monthly meetings for couples, living through these changes, to get support from one another. And if you're a family member, not everyone has the same insight around their diagnosis. Sometimes people living with the diagnosis are not interested, or they don't kind of see the big picture of these changes happening. There are definitely opportunities for caregivers and their family members to come to learn, and to get support. So that's really key.
Can I say that with the Connections group, what I've noticed too is some of the best suggestions and advice doesn't come from Neil or Monique or me. It comes from the participants that are there, that
Absolutely.
I would never have thought of those things. And it's wonderful to watch them support each other and say, oh, yes. And to see somebody come in and say, I am so angry this month. I am so angry and I don't know why, and then they talk to each other and they find out why.
No, for sure. And if anyone listening today is interested in getting more information, or if about these programs, or even support in the initial stages, as we were talking about, again, simply connect with the Dementia Society. We're a phone call away. We have a lot of, resources on our website. We're a click away or a phone call away. So you don't need to be referred by a physician or a clinic. You can make the first steps, although sometimes it's hard to make that first step. I think it's a very important one. So as we can imagine, dementia is a progressive disease. It's also irreversible. And as the disease progresses, many caregivers, find it challenging to keep their loved ones involved in meaningful activities. It might be more difficult to provide structure in the day. The person is more and more becoming dependent on their primary caregiver. They might not be able to drive, so they're not getting to where they want to, their golf game, their bridge club, etc. You mentioned day programs, Carol, but what were some other, do you think of other ways that, other strategies that you had to help Jim, and yourself, as this disease progressed and it was getting more and more difficult to maybe maintain a routine, or to, any ideas around that that you could share?
Well, our go-to was to go to Tim Hortons for coffee once, usually 4 times a week, or to drop in at friends' place for coffee, or to have breakfast with a group of friends. The other thing that the day programs that Jim went to were great. He went twice a week. That wasn't until I don't remember. That's where I met Neil, actually, because you were at the day program at Lincoln Fields. And I sat in his office and cried the first day I took Jim there. I felt so guilty. But thank you for keeping him. And he started to go to that day program, and he really enjoyed it. And for the first while, I would do all the appointments and all the chores that I needed to do. That's what I would do while Jim was at the day program. And then for some reason, I came to realize that what I should be doing is something I enjoyed. So I belonged to a community studio. And when I would drop Jim off, first of all, I'd sit out in the car and take that deep breath of, this is my time. And then I would go to the studio and stay there until, and socialize with other people and do some creative stuff. And then I would go and pick him up. Maybe I'd do a couple of chores and then I would go and pick him up. It would just gave me that break. And it was so good to see him come away feeling good about himself too, that he'd been with other people. And it's important that people with dementia socialize with other people other than their caregiver, I think. They really do seem to enjoy it. And it stimulates them in some way. The other thing that I did too, got connected with the guest house, which was for people who don't know what the guest house is. I'll let you explain it, Neil, if you want to.
Sure. Well, you've touched on some key elements on maintaining self-care, right, for caregivers. Part of that is finding time for yourself, respite time. You mentioned the day program, which is, an opportunity for a caregiver to have a day to themselves, to do whatever it is that they need to do to keep going. The guest house is maybe more long-term than a day. It could be an overnight. It could be for a weekend. Families can have up to 90 days a year of this guest house, which is run through Care4. Definitely, again, something that is sometimes difficult to set up, right? Caregivers feel, from what I hear, a lot of guilt when they are thinking about I need more time for myself. They'll say, oh, am I being selfish? I just want to have a day to myself to be able to read. I never seem to be able to meet with friends for coffee. So there's a lot of guilt in getting to access these services. It's not easy. Again, I think it's to, first of all, even have that idea of thinking about what sort of respite do I need. For some people, they need a weekend to go away to visit a family member out of town. For some people, it's if I can just find 15 minutes a day and go work in my garden, I'll be happy with that. It's different for everyone. There's never a one size fits all when it comes to self-care. But the guest house and day programs are really, I think, things to look into if you're caring for someone and you're finding, ooh, geez, I'm getting a little overwhelmed. I need time for myself to recharge. Those are really excellent resources. So thank you, Carol, for bringing that up and sharing with people that it was a success for you and Jim. It's not always easy. In the first days, you expect some hiccups and the person might be saying, you just want to get rid of me. You don't love me anymore. It's your heart is aching, right? But I think you take it slow, you get support from others who are going through this similar journey, and they'll say, you know what, you'll get through this. And if you don't succeed on the first day, try and try again. As you know, with dementia, sometimes things don't work out on the first go. You have to be persistent and keep trying, until you find just that the right time or the right approach, and you have success. So it's but it sounds as well, Carol, that you did experience a bit of that resistance from yourself as well as a caregiver. Like, reaching out is not always easy. You mentioned, I liked how you said, we moved to Ottawa. The first thing I did, called the Dementia Society, but I'm sure there were times in this journey where it was maybe more difficult to accept support, or, how did you get through that?
Well, there were times when, before Jim went into long-term care, I wanted to get somebody to come into our home to give me some respite. And that was hard, because you're relying on people you don't know to come to your home to take care of somebody that might be resistant to having them there, which he was. He didn't want anybody in the house. That was hard. I was very fortunate that I had an excellent social worker. Well, I don't know. No, she was a nurse, as the care coordinator for CCAC at the time. And she said, I think I found a way. Well, that was the other problem, getting somebody to come in. If somebody didn't need help with their activities of daily living, like bathing or, eating or whatever, dressing, which he didn't, then it was difficult to get somebody into the house to take care of somebody for a period of time, maybe a few hours, for somebody that has dementia. So that was a bit difficult. And there were times when I felt I could handle this. I can take care of this. I'm a nurse. I can take, well, of course, nurses think they can take care of everything, right? And then we find out that that we can't, and start falling apart ourselves. I developed high blood pressure, and other issues, and I think part of it was because I was trying to do it all and trying to make it look perfect. Yeah, and that never ends well when you're dealing with dementia. So yeah, I think as caregivers and say I can't do it all, and look to somebody that can help out. Sometimes my friends would want to come in and help out, but Jim wouldn't let them. So I was able to go to their house and talk to them, but yeah, it was difficult. It was difficult, and well, I feel guilty about not being able to do it all. Almost felt like a failure. Yeah.
Well, you talk about a lot of I think sentiments that people share in our group say is that dementia is also a grieving process. You're having to let go a lot of things that were what you were accustomed to from your family member, or what his abilities were, what is it, the interactions you once had, as a couple, that connection. Things are changing, and it's a grieving process. And I think I always say dementia is a very emotional, taking care of someone with dementia is a very emotional journey. You have days where you are thinking, I can manage this. Like you say, I'm a nurse, I can do this, I can cope with these changes. And the next day is like, I can't take it anymore. I'm burnt out, so.
That's when we started using the guest house, when I took him to the guest house, because I was burning out and I knew it. And I had friends that said, you are so stressed, Carol, you've got to do something. And that's when I would take him for a few days at a time to the guest house. And it was just that, you know, for a few days, and then I could regroup and go back at it. You talk about it being a grieving process. It's chronic grief that you feel, because along the way you lose a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And I say, I don't cry now, but I cried buckets during that period of time. And I remember at the wives group, the first thing that Merle would do is put the Kleenex on the table, because she knew there was going to be somebody in tears that day. And that's okay, you know, and a lot of my crying I did in the shower, because I didn't want Jim to see, because he'd get upset, because he'd want to know why are you crying? And if I told him, then he would be upset. And I thought, I can't deal with that. So yeah, there's actually a really good book that I read about this. It's called Ambiguous Loss by Pauline Boss, and I recommend that to people. It's when physically the person is still with you, but emotionally they're not there anymore. Mentally they're not there anymore. So it's kind of it's a loss over a period of time. Yeah, it's quite unique to dementia as the person deteriorates. Yeah.
No, absolutely, Carol. Again, thanks for sharing those intimate details. I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate as well to these feelings you're sharing. But I think it's always important as well to, you know, we talk about dementia as, you know, obstacles, challenges, disabilities, but also and I'm sure you've done this as a caregiver, is to look at, you know, what does remain with your family member, what works well, the successes, like using humor to get through a tough day. You know, again, we'll talk with families and they'll say, for example, my mom used to be a great knitter. She'd knit sweaters and intricate patterns, and now, you know, it's sad to see she's lost that skill. But then through a conversation, you know, you give mom her knitting needles and some yarn, and she might be able to sew a simple scarf, or these, you know, cloths that we use to wash dishes or whatever. Like, I find there's always and that's what the challenge is to find in your loved one what remains, what are his or her strengths. But I think that's also very key, right, for your well-being and theirs as well, because everyone living with dementia still needs to feel valued, and that they're contributing, and that they are needed. But it's adapting to these changes, which is, I think, really sometimes challenging, but so important at the same time.
I can give you an example of, we had a dog at the time, and Jim would walk the dog twice a day, and there was a route that he would go. We had a walkway, and then one day he's walking the dog, and I live in a row like of townhouses that all look the same, right? And we had a red car, and there was a red car in a driveway a few doors down. Well, Jim went to that house, and the door was locked. And so he sat down on the front porch waiting for me to come home. And the man inside noticed somebody sitting on his front step with this dog. And he went out, and they managed to find out that Jim actually lived a few doors down, and he brought him home. So I thought, now what can I do? Because the one thing, it got him exercise, it got the dog exercise, it gave me like 20 minutes to myself or half an hour. And how can I make sure that he gets home? So I thought about it, and I wrote our address on the leash, the dog's leash, so that he knew he could find this, and he could still read at the time. He couldn't read anymore, but it was one way of maintaining that routine, which was important to him. It was something he could do and he enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
I didn't care for walking the dog, but he did. So, so that worked until it didn't anymore. So.
But that's a great example on how you adapt to these changes, eh? And I think with some brainstorming or whatever, whether it's connecting with different group members at our support groups or talking to a dementia care coach, I think there's always, I like to think that there's always a solution to every problem, eh? And that's a great example on, you know, finding ways around safety to still allow, you know, Jim to go out for as much loved walks in the neighborhood with your dog, and yet still remaining safe, eh? And you not worrying maybe as much. So that's a great example. So you mentioned long-term care, Carol. You know, and there is a time when a person's needs just keep increasing, and you know, things like increased need with personal care, or the person is starting to wander at night or not sleeping, and the caregiver is just feeling overwhelmed. Plus, the reality is this is a long road. Some people have been caregivers for 5, 6, 7 years, and they're getting exhausted, like you mentioned, high blood pressure. You know, you're starting to experience health changes yourself as a caregiver, and sometimes people will say, well, you know, Carol, I think it's time that you start looking for, you know, a new home. And that's a really difficult decision, I'm sure. Can you tell us a bit about how that was for you, like the decision to say, you know what, home is no longer the best place for Jim. I need to look at alternatives. Like, tell us a bit about that.
Well, I had Jim's name on, I was advised to visit various long-term care facilities and get his name on some lists, because the waiting lists for the better ones, I don't know what else to call them, because there are some that are not so great, but the waiting lists for those better ones are quite long. They can be anywhere from 2 years to 5 years. And I had his name on a long-term care facility out in Elmont, the Fairview Manor, for 2.5 years. And the day that I got the call, I felt it was a little premature, that I could have kept him home longer. But the catch is that if you don't say yes to that offer of a bed, your file's closed at CCAC. Well, it was CCAC at the time. Now it's through the LIN. And the person's name goes to the bottom of the list, and you may wait a lot longer. So I did accept that. I actually very quickly talked to some people, you know, his kids and friends, and my friends said, my friends knew that I was exhausted, and I decided that yes, he should go. It had to be the worst decision I've ever had to make. I felt so guilty about putting him in care. Even though it was a lovely place, it's still not a place that many people want to go to. And it was, there were many days that I would leave him. I went to visit him every other day because it was in Elmont. I live in Canada. And so it was a long drive, 30 minutes each way. And I went every other day to see him. Every other day I'm driving home and I'm in tears until I get halfway home, because I felt so badly about leaving him there. As much as they did great care, and I chose that place because I knew the help was local. I used to work at the Elmont Hospital years ago, and I knew people there. And it's connected to the hospital, which I felt was a really good idea too. So, but it's never an easy decision to make for people. And I don't think I've ever talked to anybody that hasn't felt guilty about doing this.
For sure. Any thoughts though around guilt and how to overcome these feelings of guilt that you experience? Like, I'm sure your role over time as a caregiver evolved once Jim was in care, you know, or did it, or, you know, but that feeling of guilt, I think, is something that is a common thread. They say caregivers have, you know, your constant companions as a dementia caregiver. You have these companions that follow you all through this journey, and it's anger and sadness and guilt. That seems to be the three sentiments that are always there. It's finding ways to cope. So again, in these later stages, what helped you deal with those feelings?
Well, I think talking about it with other people that had to make the decision, getting the support from them, I think that really was the key for me, that I wasn't a horrible person. Because I felt like a horrible person. I felt like a failure. On the same side, I felt relief. I remember being able to sleep through the night again, you know, not waking up with a headache every day. So there was that as well that I felt guilty about. That, you know, the burden was being shared by somebody else. The main part of the burden was being shared by somebody else. So, and I could be the person that would go in and be the good guy. You know, I just want to say that there were some really funny times in there too. There were times he didn't remember that we were married. And I remember going in one day and he'd say, you know, we see a lot of each other. Maybe we should get married. And I told him, well, we've been married for 23 years. And he said, oh, he says, everybody okay with that? And I said, well, it's a little late now if they're not. So yeah. He said, oh, good. Yeah. So, you know, there were some lighter times in all of this too, even with the things that were happening with him. So it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Well, for sure. And like you would probably experience as well in our support groups, that's something that, you know, we experience a lot. Sometimes there'll be stories like that, and just the genuine laughter that comes from the group. And sometimes I think if there's someone in another room, like all of a sudden listening to this roar of laughter, they're thinking, is there really a dementia, you know, support group going on in there? There's a lot of laughter. And I think this is how you live well with dementia, is to look for those little moments, that are there, if, you know, and to hold on to those moments too from time to time to get you through these feelings of guilt and sadness and anger, is to, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Sometimes in our groups too, Carol, we talk about these mantras or these rules that might help caregivers, you know, through these sometimes challenging situation. We'll say sometimes, you know what, you have to live one day at a time, and sometimes it's even one moment in this day at a time. Like, do you find that kind of philosophy has helped you through sometimes difficult times? We say, you know, to caregivers, try and be mindful, live in the moment. You know, try not to see yourself in a month from now or 2 months from now, and try and not to say, oh, why can't things be the way they used to be? You know, and to just be in that moment. Like, how does any thoughts on that, Carol?
Well, it's certainly something that I used to teach people with addictions. They're taught from the beginning, if they're in their recovery, to live a day at a time. And picture your time as a package. This is it. This is all you've got. And you can handle that. But if you look too far down the road, of course, not knowing where this is going and how long it's going to take, that can be very depressing. So I found that very helpful. And also, you know, when there's a saying that, well, I didn't know it then, but I know now, is connect, don't correct. So connecting with a person's reality, the person with dementia, their reality, instead of trying to correct them all the time, because correcting leads to a lot of arguments and a lot of frustration for the caregiver. One of the terms that, or a sentence that the nurse at the Alzheimer's Society in Sarnia taught me, she said, well, you can always say to him, if you're having this difference of opinion, you can always say to him, well, you might be right. And I say, well, but I know I'm right. And she said, you're not saying he's right. You're saying you might be right.
Yeah.
And that solved more issues. And then distracting and going someplace like Tim Hortons or the Dairy Queen or something like that, and moving on, like choosing what you're going to spend your time with, and not, you know, how important is this, is another one.
Yes.
Yeah, some of those things really were helpful, and I've learned a number of them over the years that have been very helpful. Yeah, but definitely staying in today is important. This is all you've got, and you know, we never know if we've got tomorrow, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
No, this has been a great conversation, Carol. I really appreciate your insight and sharing your experiences with the listeners. And I'm just aware that it's almost 1 and we kind of have to wrap things up. But I just want, if there's a takeaway that I'd like to share, I mean, I'll let you, Carol, share your takeaway. But for me, is to people out there who are living as caregivers of people living with dementia, you know, connect with the society. We have a lot of wonderful opportunities to learn more about the disease, to connect with others for support. We have a lot of resource on our website, a lot of on-demand learning, so pre-recorded sessions for caregivers. Support groups usually are in person. Now, because of these COVID days, everything is online through Zoom, but still out. I think we have over 20 different types of support groups that people can connect for support. And just on the phone, we're still available. It's kind of business as usual for us, but we do things virtually instead of in person. So please contact us, you know, if you have questions or you'd like to get some support. So that's my, Carol, do you have a takeaway message that you'd like people to leave with, or any final thoughts?
These are difficult times for caregivers right now, not being able to access services in person. I'm sure everybody's heard it. When you think you've come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Because you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, and you can do it. You got this. You know, you may not feel like it today, but that's the time that you can call a dementia care coach and get you know, let them charge you up again and give you some support.
For sure. Sometimes just having someone to talk to is you might not find that solution right there and then, but a lot of times, you know, people will, you know, stop the conversation by saying, you know what, I don't know if we've achieved anything, but just talking to you certainly feels good. So definitely.
That's great. Yeah.
Do you have that slide, Carol? I think Carol has a, we'll see, we're Carol and I are not technically technical, but maybe
I'm here, guy, anyways. Oh,
pardon me, Herman?
I'm here. Yes, I'm here. So just let me know if you need anything else.
Well, just to share our contact information, our website and our phone number.
Okay, it's not letting me do it, Herman. For some reason, I am not able to do it.
You can find share screen on the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, and then it just takes me to a whiteboard. Just a minute. Yeah.
Oh, there.
Okay, it's doing something. Oh, it's loading the whole Dementia Friendly Communities thing. Okay,
Well, just in the meantime, if anyone has a question, you can also ask a question to Neil and Carol right away. There's a chat box at the bottom of your screen, and also you can raise your hand. You can wave your hand so we can allow you to talk as well in this presentation.
You got that? No?
Yeah, someone has a question here. So, okay, so Haiti, so you can talk now.
Okay, Lloyd.
Let's go ahead and ask a question.
I didn't have one.
I thought you had one. Sorry.
Okay.
No question.
No question? Okay. Well, there you go.
There it is.
There it is. I did it.
Yeah. So as you can see, we have our Ottawa number. If you call, there'll be, you know, someone to take your call. Our hours are Monday to Thursday, 8:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. And on Fridays, we're 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. And there is a Renfrew County office as well. You can email us with your questions or for us to get in touch with you with a good time, let's say to, you know, call me next Tuesday at 10 o'clock. And also our website, again, like I said, with a lot of, you know, helpful resources and ways to stay connected with people. So.
All right, so there's a comment here from Leslie. So it says, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation, a great introduction for people just starting on this journey. I'll be sharing this recording with friends. Great chat. Thank you. It says also Cynthia.
Great.
Anyone has a question or a comment? All right, so before we end our webinar today, so thank you very much for joining us. Just to remind the audience that we have actually also a weekly roundup, so you can register for meaningful activities and get the information, the updated information from the Dementia Society of Ottawa and Renfrew County. So thank you, Neil and Carol, for your time and for this great chat. I think we had a great learning today. It was very, very educational, very informative. So thank you very much to all for joining us today. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.